Title: The Rebellion of Harmony Lane. New character names: Karen Lydia Grayson, the HOA Queen, a control-obsessed woman in her late 40s. Jake Miller Ethan Caldwell, a dedicated firefighter, mid-30s, exhausted but resilient. Sparky Rusty, Ethan's loyal golden retriever. Mr. Thompson Harold Bennett, a retired lawyer, witty and observant, early 70s. Fire Chief Daniel Russo, a no-nonsense leader with a dry sense of humor. Expanded setting. The neighborhood, now called Harmony Lane, is a picturesque suburban enclave with manicured lawns, pastel houses, and a tense undercurrent of HOA control. The story unfolds over several days in early March 2025, with weather shifting from crisp mornings to stormy evenings, mirroring the escalating conflict. Part breakdown. The quiet of Harmony Lane shattered at exactly 7:02 a.m. On March 6, 2025. Tires screeched against asphalt, a piercing sound that sliced through the stillness of the suburban morning like a knife through butter. Birds scattered from the neatly trimmed hedges lining the street, and a few curtains twitched as sleepy residents peeked out to investigate. At the center of the commotion stood a hulking red fire truck, its polished chrome glinting in the early sunlight, parked squarely in the middle of a pristine driveway at 14 Harmony Lane. To most, it was just a vehicle, a symbol of safety, of lives saved. But to Lydia Grayson, self-appointed guardian of Harmony Lane's aesthetic perfection, it was an abomination. She stomped across the lawn in front of the house, her bright teal power suit a stark contrast to the muted greens and beiges of the neighborhood. In one hand, she clutched a clipboard stacked with HOA violation notices. In the other, a steaming cup of black coffee sloshed dangerously with each furious step. Her face twisted into a mask of outrage as she glared at the truck, her lips pursed so tightly they could have cracked a walnut. Lydia had ruled Harmony Lane's Homeowners Association for nearly a decade, her reign marked by an iron grip on rules she'd practically memorized. No unapproved paint colors. No overgrown shrubs. No garbage cans left out past 7:30 a.m. And, most importantly, no commercial vehicles parked in driveways. That fire truck, with its bold red paint and ladder rungs, was a glaring violation of everything she stood for, a personal affront to the order she'd spent years cultivating. She marched up to the front door of 14 Harmony Lane, her heels sinking slightly into the dew-soaked grass, and pounded on the wood with the force of a battering ram. Inside, Ethan Caldwell groaned, his face still pressed into the worn leather cushion of his couch. He'd just come off a brutal 48-hour shift at the fire station, 2 house fires, a car accident, and a cat stuck in a storm drain. His muscles ached, his eyes burned, and all he wanted was sleep. Beside him, Rusty, his golden retriever, stretched out on the rug, yawning with a lazy wag of his tail, utterly unbothered by the chaos brewing outside. Ethan rubbed his eyes and squinted at the clock on the wall. 7:02 a.m. "Who the hell knocks like that at this hour?" he muttered, dragging himself upright. His dark hair stuck up in odd angles, and his station t-shirt was wrinkled from hours of restless half-sleep. The pounding grew louder, more insistent, and he stumbled to the door, yanking it open with a mix of irritation and exhaustion. Lydia stood there, her glare sharp enough to cut glass. Without a word, she thrust the clipboard toward him, a yellow violation notice fluttering at the top. "You're in violation," she declared, her voice dripping with the kind of authority that existed only in her own head. "This neighborhood has strict rules against commercial vehicles and driveways, and that," she jabbed a manicured finger at the fire truck, "is a commercial vehicle." Ethan blinked, his brain still foggy from sleep. "It's not commercial," he said, his voice rough. "It's my personal truck. I'm a firefighter. You know, emergency services? Saving lives." Lydia's lips tightened into a thin, dangerous line. "I don't care if you're pulling orphans from a volcano. The rules apply to everyone. That's a $500 fine." She tapped the clipboard for emphasis, as if it were a gavel slamming down a verdict. Ethan let out a disbelieving laugh, running a hand through his hair. "You're kidding, right?" "Do I look like I'm kidding?" Lydia snapped, her coffee sloshing dangerously close to the edge of her cup. Before Ethan could respond, Rusty trotted up to the door, his tail wagging like a metronome. He sniffed the clipboard, Then, with a gleeful chomp, snatched the fine from Ethan's hand. In seconds, the paper was shredded between his teeth, the yellow scraps fluttering down onto Lydia's pristine white sneakers like confetti. Rusty sat back, panting proudly, a slobbery grin on his face. For the first time in her HOA career, Lydia was speechless. Her eyes twitched as she stared at the soggy remains of her authority now decorating her footwear. Then, as if a switch flipped, she gasped dramatically. Destruction of HOA property. That's another fine. Ethan ran a hand down his face, exhaustion giving way to incredulity. This is not how I planned to spend my morning, he muttered. He'd barely slept. His body still ached from hauling people out of a burning apartment complex the night before, and now he was being ticketed by the neighborhood dictator. Look, Lydia, he said, trying to keep his tone even. This is ridiculous. I'm not some guy parking a taco truck in my driveway. I live here. I work for this city. That truck? It's the reason people are alive today. Lydia's expression didn't soften. If anything, her resolve hardened. Rules are rules. If I let you slide, the next thing you know, someone's putting up a neon sign, and we'll have a carnival in the cul-de-sac. Ethan's patience, already threadbare, snapped. A carnival? Seriously? I'm parking my truck in my own driveway, not building a Ferris wheel in the front yard. Across the street, a door creaked open. Harold Bennett, a retired lawyer with a shock of white hair and a perpetual smirk, stepped onto his porch, cradling a mug of coffee. He'd lived on Harmony Lane for 20 years and had seen Lydia's antics escalate from petty nitpicking to full-blown tyranny. Morning, Ethan, he called, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. I see you've met the HOA's resident menace. Lydia whipped around, her teal blazer rustling. I'm enforcing community standards, Harold. Right, Harold chuckled, taking a sip of his coffee. Like when you find Mrs. Larson for her aggressively festive Christmas lights. Nearly blinded me driving home. Lydia's eyes narrowed. I almost crashed my car. Ethan pinched the bridge of his nose, feeling a headache brewing. So what am I supposed to do, Lydia? Park my truck 2 streets over? What happens if there's an emergency and I need to get to the station fast? Lydia crossed her arms, her clipboard tucked under one elbow. That's not my problem. Pay the fine or have it towed. Your choice. Ethan's jaw tightened. You can't just tow an emergency responder's vehicle. Lydia smirked, a glint of triumph in her eyes. Watch me. Rusty let out a low growl, sensing the tension, and Lydia took a cautious step back, eyeing the dog warily. And keep that mutt under control, she huffed. Ethan exhaled slowly, fighting the urge to argue further. He knew Lydia wouldn't back down. She thrived on control, and conceding wasn't in her vocabulary. Just then, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, squinting at the screen. A text from the station, house fire on Pinewood Drive. All available units report immediately. His heart kicked into gear, adrenaline surging through his veins. I've got to go, he said, turning toward the truck, but Lydia wasn't done. In a move that defied all logic, she stepped directly in front of the vehicle, blocking his path. You're not going anywhere until this is resolved, she said, her voice icy. Ethan froze, staring at her in disbelief. Are you serious? Absolutely, she replied, planting her feet. You break the rules, you deal with the consequences. The distant wail of sirens cut through the air, faint at first, but growing louder. Lydia's smirk held steady, but as the sound intensified, multiple sirens, not just one, her confidence flickered. Ethan's lips twitched into a small, knowing grin. Looks like my backup's here. Around the corner roared a convoy of fire trucks, their red lights flashing like a storm rolling in. They pulled onto Harmony Lane, lining the street like a fleet of giants, engines rumbling. Chief Daniel Russo stepped out of the lead truck, his salt and pepper hair catching the morning light. He took one look at the scene, Ethan blocked by a woman in a teal suit clutching a clipboard, and sighed heavily. Ethan, he called, his voice gruff. Why the hell aren't you on your way to the fire? Ethan gestured toward Lydia. Ask her. All eyes turned to Lydia, who suddenly looked less like a queen and more like a deer caught in headlights. The neighbors began to gather, whispering among themselves, some stifling grins. Harold chuckled into his coffee. Well, this just got interesting. Lydia opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. The fire trucks loomed behind her, a wall of red and chrome, and for the first time that morning, she realized she might have underestimated her opponent. The sirens grew deafening as the convoy of fire trucks rolled to a stop along Harmony Lane, their engines idling with a low, menacing growl. Chief Daniel Russo's boots hit the pavement with a thud, his broad frame casting a shadow over Lydia Grayson as she stood defiantly in front of Ethan Caldwell's fire truck. The morning sun glinted off the chief's badge, and his weathered face carried the kind of authority that didn't need a clipboard to back it up. Lydia's teal blazer seemed to shrink under his gaze, but she held her ground, clutching her coffee cup like a shield. "Lady," Russo said, his voice cutting through the tension, "unless you've got a fire hidden behind that clipboard, I suggest you step aside." Lydia's lips parted, ready to launch into her usual tirade about rules and standards, but the words caught in her throat. The neighbors, now a small crowd spilling onto porches and lawns, watched with bated breath, some recording the standoff on their phones. Ethan leaned against his truck, arms crossed, a mix of exhaustion and amusement flickering in his hazel eyes. Rusty sat beside him, tail thumping the ground, oblivious to the drama. "I'm enforcing HOA regulations," Lydia finally managed, though her voice wavered slightly. "This is a private matter." "Private?" Russo interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "You're blocking a firefighter from responding to an emergency. That's not private. That's a problem." He glanced at Ethan. "Pinewood Drive's burning, kid. Get moving." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He yanked open the driver's door, but Lydia took a bold step closer, her heels clicking against the asphalt. "You can't just ignore the rules because you're in a hurry." Ethan paused, one foot on the running board, and turned to her, his patience evaporating. "Lydia, people could be dying right now. Move, or I'll move you myself." The threat hung in the air, sharp and real. Lydia's eyes widened, but before she could respond, Russo stepped forward, his presence towering over her. "Ma'am, I don't know what kind of power trip you're on, but you're about to learn a hard lesson. Step aside." The crowd murmured, a ripple of approval spreading through them. Harold Bennett, still sipping his coffee on his porch, called out, "Better listen, Lydia. You're outmatched this time." Lydia's face flushed an impressive shade of crimson. She opened her mouth, closed it, then, with a reluctant huff, stepped aside. Ethan climbed into the cab, fired up the engine, and peeled out of the driveway, the truck's tires kicking up a faint cloud of dust. The convoy followed, a procession of red giants roaring down Harmony Lane, leaving Lydia standing alone in their wake. She straightened her blazer, brushing off invisible dirt, and turned to the gathered neighbors. "This isn't over," she announced, her voice regaining its self-righteous edge. "That man blatantly disrespected HOA regulations, and I won't let it go unpunished." Harold chuckled, shaking his head. "What's the plan, Lydia? You gonna find the whole fire department now?" Her lips thinned, but she didn't reply. With a final glare at the dispersing crowd, she stormed back to her house at 8 Harmony Lane, slamming the door behind her. Inside, she paced her immaculate living room, the hardwood floors gleaming under the morning light filtering through spotless windows. Her phone sat on the coffee table, and she snatched it up, dialing the HOA board president, Mark Ellison. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. With a frustrated growl, she tossed the phone onto the couch and sank into an armchair, her mind racing. This wasn't just about a fire truck. It was about control, her control. Harmony Lane was her domain, a perfect little world she'd sculpted with rules and fines and relentless oversight. Ethan Caldwell and his truck threatened that order, and if she let it slide, the cracks would spread. She couldn't allow that. Meanwhile, Ethan sped toward Pinewood Drive, the adrenaline drowning out his exhaustion. The fire was a beast, flames licking the roof of a 2-story house, black smoke billowing into the sky. His crew was already on scene, hoses blasting water in coordinated arcs. Ethan suited up in record time, his helmet snug against his head, and joined the fray. The heat was suffocating, the roar of the fire deafening, but he moved with practiced precision, hauling a hose, shouting orders, breaking down a door to pull a dazed teenager to safety. It took an hour to subdue the blaze, and another 30 minutes to ensure it wouldn't reignite. By the time they packed up, Ethan's face was streaked with soot, his muscles screaming for rest. He leaned against the truck, catching his breath, when Russo approached, wiping his own grimy forehead. "You want to tell me why I had to send half the station to your street this morning?" the chief asked, his tone dry. Ethan sighed, peeling off his gloves. "Long story. I've got time." Ethan smirked, recounting the absurdity. Lydia's fine, Rusty's shredding, her blocking the truck. Russo stared at him, then let out a low, exasperated laugh. "You've got to be kidding me." "I wish," Ethan said. "She's got it out for me now." Russo shook his head. "Need me to handle it? I can make a call, scare her straight." "Tempting," Ethan admitted, "but I think she's digging her own grave. Half the neighborhood's already fed up with her." The chief clapped him on the shoulder. "Get some rest, kid. Something tells me she's not done yet." Back on Harmony Lane, the day unfolded quietly, at least on the surface. Neighbors whispered about the morning's showdown, some laughing, others shaking their heads. Lydia's absence from her usual patrols felt like a temporary ceasefire, but no one believed it would last. Ethan returned home just after noon, his truck rumbling into the driveway. He half expected Lydia to be waiting, clipboard in hand, but the street was empty. Rusty greeted him with a slobbery lick, and Ethan collapsed onto the couch, too tired to even kick off his boots. Across the street, Harold Bennett watched from his porch, flipping through an old binder of HOA bylaws he'd kept from his lawyer days. He'd never liked Lydia's reign. Too many fines, too much meddling. The fire truck incident was the tipping point, and he smelled an opportunity. If Ethan was willing to push back, Harold could help turn the tide. He scribbled a note and tucked it into his pocket, planning to slip it under Ethan's door later. By late afternoon, Lydia emerged from her house, her teal suit swapped for a crisp white blouse and navy slacks. She carried a stack of flyers, new violation notices, this time targeting Ethan's unauthorized vehicle. She slipped them into mailboxes along the street, her jaw set with determination. If the HOA board wouldn't answer her calls, she'd remind everyone who kept Harmony Lane in line. But the flyers didn't go unnoticed. Mrs. Larson, a grandmotherly woman with a penchant for garish holiday decorations, pulled one from her mailbox and snorted. "She's lost it," she muttered, crumpling the paper. Down the street, the Patel family, whose basketball hoop had earned them a $200 fine last summer, read theirs and exchanged a look. "This is about the firefighter, isn't it?" "Mr. Patel said." His wife nodded. "She's picking the wrong fight." As dusk settled over Harmony Lane, a storm brewed on the horizon, both literal and figurative. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the air grew heavy with the promise of rain. Ethan woke to Rusty nudging his hand, the dog restless as the wind picked up. He glanced out the window and saw Lydia's silhouette moving from house to house, her flyers a declaration of war. He sighed, knowing this was far from over. But for the first time, he felt a spark of something else, resolve. If Lydia wanted a fight, she'd get one. And he wouldn't be alone. The storm broke over Harmony Lane that night, rain hammering rooftops and lightning splitting the sky. Ethan lay awake, the rhythmic drumming on his windows mingling with Rusty's soft snores. He couldn't shake the image of Lydia's smug face, or the growing sense that this was about more than a truck. It was personal now, a test of wills, and he wasn't sure how far she'd go. Morning brought a soggy calm, the street glistening under a gray sky. Ethan stepped outside to check his truck, water pooling around its tires in the driveway. A yellow flyer clung to his mailbox, soaked but legible. Notice of violation, unauthorized commercial vehicle. $500 fine. Additional penalties pending. He crumpled it and tossed it into the trash, muttering, "She doesn't quit." Across the street, Harold Bennett emerged with his coffee, spotting Ethan. He waved him over, holding up the binder of HOA bylaws. "Got a minute, son?" Ethan crossed the wet lawn, Rusty trotting at his heels. Harold's porch smelled of damp wood and roasted beans, a comforting contrast to the tension simmering on the street. "What's up?" Ethan asked. Harold tapped the binder. "Been digging through this. Lydia's got no legal leg to stand on. That truck's not commercial, it's emergency equipment. State law trumps HOA rules on this. She's bluffing." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" 30 years as a lawyer," Harold said with a grin. "I know a bully when I see one. She's overreached, and folks are noticing. Ethan glanced down the street, where a few neighbors were already out, eyeing their own soggy flyers with frowns. Think they'll push back? They're halfway there, Harold said. You just keep doing what you do. She'll trip over her own ego soon enough. The day passed uneventfully, a rare reprieve. Ethan caught up on sleep, patched a leaky gutter, and tossed a ball for Rusty in the backyard. But by evening, Lydia made her next move. As Ethan grilled a burger on his patio, headlights swept across his driveway, a tow truck, its amber lights flashing. Lydia stood beside it, arms crossed, her navy slacks damp from the lingering puddles. Ethan stepped outside, burger forgotten. You've got to be kidding me. I warned you, Lydia said, her voice clipped. Since you refused to comply, I've escalated the matter. HOA regulations allow towing of violating vehicles at the owner's expense. The tow truck driver, a wiry man with a nervous twitch, climbed out, eyeing Ethan's truck warily. Is this actually a commercial vehicle? 'Cause I don't want to tow a firefighter's rig, lady. Lydia's jaw tightened. It's unauthorized. That's all that matters. Ethan took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm. Lydia, for the last time, this isn't a commercial vehicle. I don't sell anything with it. It's an emergency responder truck. The driver hesitated, glancing between them. Neighbors began to gather again, phones out, murmurs of disbelief rippling through the crowd. Mrs. Larson whispered to the Patels, she's gone too far. Harold watched from his porch, shaking his head. Then, as if scripted, sirens wailed in the distance, low at first, then louder. Lydia's eyes flickered with unease as the familiar red convoy rolled onto Harmony Lane, lights flashing but sirens muted, a deliberate show of force. Chief Russo stepped out, his expression a mix of irritation and amusement. What the hell's going on now? He barked, taking in the tow truck, Lydia, and Ethan's clenched fists. Lydia squared her shoulders. This is an internal HOA matter. You can't just barge in. Russo let out a slow breath, his boots crunching against the wet pavement. Lady, do you have any idea what you're doing? You're interfering with emergency personnel. That's not an HOA issue. That's illegal. It's not like he's responding to a fire right now, Lydia scoffed. The chief's laugh was humorless. That's not how this works. That truck's part of emergency response. Blocking it, fining it, towing it, you're obstructing a first responder. You want to test that in court. The tow truck driver raised his hands. Yeah, I'm out. I don't get paid enough for this. He hopped back into his cab and sped off, leaving Lydia stranded. The neighbors erupted into quiet applause, some whistling. Harold gave a thumbs up. Told you she'd trip, he called to Ethan. Lydia's face burned, but she tried to rally. This isn't over. I'll take it to the HOA board. Russo smirked. You do that. And while you're at it, look up the laws on obstructing emergency personnel. Try this again, and you won't like the consequences. Ethan leaned against his truck, a grin tugging at his lips. Hear that, Lydia? Maybe find yourself for a change. She sputtered, then stormed off, slamming her door. Russo clapped Ethan on the back. Get some rest. She's a bulldog, but she's running out of tricks. The fire trucks pulled away, and Harmony Lane buzzed with chatter. Inside her house, Lydia paced, dialing Mark Ellison again. This time, he answered, groggy and annoyed. Lydia, it's 10 p.m. What now? I need to file a complaint against Ethan Caldwell, she snapped. He's defying HOA rules, disrupting the peace. You mean the firefighter? Mark cut in, his tone sharpening. The one you tried to tow? People are furious, Lydia. The board's getting flooded with calls. They're overreacting, she said. I'm protecting this community. No, you're embarrassing it, Mark shot back. We had an emergency meeting tonight. You're out as enforcer. Unanimous vote. Lydia's stomach dropped. You can't. We did, he said. You've turned the HOA into a joke. It's over. The line went dead. She stood frozen, the phone trembling in her hand. Outside, the rain had stopped, but a new storm was brewing, one she couldn't control. The next morning, Harmony Lane woke to an unfamiliar peace. No Lydia patrolling with her clipboard, no fines slipped under doors. The air felt lighter, the gray sky giving way to tentative sunlight. Ethan stepped outside, coffee in hand, and noticed the change immediately. Rusty bounded into the yard, chasing a squirrel, while neighbors lingered on their porches, chatting without the usual rush to hide trash cans or trim hedges. Ethan's phone buzzed, a text from Russo. Heard the HOA ladies out. You owe me a beer. He chuckled, replying, make it two. The news spread fast. Mrs. Larson stopped by with a plate of cookies, her eyes twinkling. Heard you took down the tyrant, she said. About time. Not just me, Ethan said, accepting the cookies. She did most of the work herself. Down the street, the Patels strung up lights for an impromptu gathering, a barbecue. They'd decided to celebrate. Word spread, and by noon, Harmony Lane was abuzz with plans. Ethan volunteered his grill, the fire station crew promised to drop by, and Harold offered his legal binder as a trophy of sorts. Frame it, he joked. Proof we beat the system. Inside 8, Harmony Lane, Lydia watched from her window, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. The HOA board's betrayal stung deep. She'd given years to this neighborhood, keeping lawns perfect, property values high, and now they'd cast her aside like trash. She'd spent the night drafting emails, calling board members, pleading her case, but no one answered. Mark's words echoed, "You've turned us into a joke." She refused to accept it. Slipping into a gray skirt suit, she grabbed her clipboard and stormed outside, determined to reassert control. But the street had changed overnight. Kids played in yards, unbothered by her usual glare. Mr. Patel waved cheerfully, stringing lights without a permit. Lydia's fists clenched, but she pressed on, heading for Ethan's house. He was in the driveway, loading a cooler into his truck, when she approached. Enjoying your victory? She snapped. Ethan turned, unfazed. Just living my life, Lydia. You should try it. This isn't over, she said. I'll fight this. The HOA needs structure. The HOA doesn't need you, Ethan cut in. And no one wants you in charge anymore. It's done. She seethed, but he was right. The barbecue took shape around her. Tables set up, music playing, laughter filling the air. By evening, Harmony Lane was alive in a way it hadn't been in years. The fire crew arrived, Russo leading the pack, and neighbors lined up to thank them. Ethan stood at the grill, flipping burgers, Rusty at his feet, while Harold regaled the crowd with tales of Lydia's past overreaches, her war on Mrs. Larson's lights, her crusade against the Patels' hoop. Lydia watched from her window, the sounds of joy mocking her isolation. She'd spent so long enforcing perfection that she'd forgotten what a neighborhood was, people, not rules. But surrender wasn't in her nature. She turned away, plotting her next move, her resolve hardening like steel. The barbecue stretched into the night, Harmony Lane glowing under string lights and the flicker of a bonfire. Laughter mingled with the sizzle of meat on Ethan's grill, and kids darted between tables, clutching sparklers. The fire crew swapped stories with neighbors, Russo's deep laugh cutting through the chatter. A sign stood in front of Lydia's house, bold letters proclaiming, "Celebrating the end of HOA tyranny, free food, all welcome." Ethan leaned against his truck, a beer in hand, watching the scene unfold. It felt good, better than good. For the first time since moving to Harmony Lane 2 years ago, it felt like home. Mrs. Larson nudged him, grinning. You started this, you know. Nah, Ethan said. Lydia did. I just lit the match. Across the street, Lydia paced her living room, the noise seeping through her walls. The sign was the final straw, a public humiliation she couldn't ignore. She slipped into a black coat, grabbed her phone, and marched outside, ready to tear it down. But as she reached for it, Harold appeared, coffee mug in hand. Wouldn't do that, he said mildly. Folks are in a mood tonight. They're mocking me, Lydia hissed. They're celebrating, Harold corrected. Big difference. She glared, but the crowd's energy was palpable, united, defiant. She stormed toward Ethan, shoving past a group of kids. You think this is funny? She demanded. Ethan shrugged. I think it's hilarious. Her voice rose. Enjoy it while it lasts. I'll fight this. You're done, Lydia, Ethan said, his tone firm but not cruel. Look around. No one's on your side. She froze, scanning the faces, Mrs. Larson's smirk, the Patel's nods, Russo's steady gaze. The realization hit like a punch. She'd lost them. Not just the board, but the neighborhood. With a furious huff, she retreated, the party roaring on behind her. Days passed, and Harmony Lane settled into a new rhythm. No fines, no clipboard patrols, just people living. Ethan fixed his truck, played fetch with Rusty, and swapped shifts at the station, his life quieter but richer. The barbecue had bonded the street, a turning point no one wanted to undo. Lydia stayed indoors, her blinds shut, her phone silent. The board ignored her pleas, and neighbors avoided her gaze. One morning, she stepped outside, expecting hostility, but found a flyer under her door. Harmony Lane Cleanup Day, join us. It was unsigned, a peace offering she didn't deserve. She stood at her window, watching Ethan and the Patels rake leaves, Mrs. Larson handing out lemonade. For years, she'd seen chaos in their freedom. Now, she saw community. Her rules had choked it, her control a cage. She didn't join them, but she didn't fight, either. It was a start. Weeks later, Ethan spotted her at the edge of a neighborhood meeting, listening, not speaking. She'd lost her throne, but Harmony Lane had gained something better. As spring bloomed, the street thrived, imperfect, messy, alive. And for the first time in years, it truly felt like home.